Hello and welcome once again to Centered to the Left, the show put on by Missoula's social and environmental activists to explore different issues that are happening around the community and occasionally around the nation. Recently you may have seen some shows put on the bison issue, the Big Mountain issue, and some of Missoula's growth issues. Tonight we have Lisa Moscow with us, who has done a video production that's focused around the Alberton spill that happened a few years back when a train having chlorine and other chemicals derailed and spilled a lot of these chemicals into the community of Alberton about 20 miles from here. Before getting into that, I'd just like to invite folks to join us. We welcome folks with issues, with time, with interest to come and be part of our production, to join our team, to get their issues aired. We're always looking for new issues and new people and new energy. And this is a start of a two-part show, so be aware of that. We air on Sunday nights at 8 o'clock. And then we re-air the show on Monday at 5:30. So if you're not going to be able to be around Sunday night next week and you can catch us on Monday night, that would be great. You can still see this two-part show. So welcome tonight, Lisa. Lisa has produced a video called "A Toxic Train Runs Through It." Could you tell us a little bit about why you took on this project?
Thanks. In 1996, there was the largest mixed chemical rail spill in Alberton, Montana, which is only 32 miles west of Missoula. And one of the reasons that I took on this project was because people are still suffering from that spill. And there are a lot of people in the larger community of Montana who don't know that these people are still suffering, who don't understand the gravity of the spill, and also there's still a lot of hazardous chemicals traveling through towns every day, and there are a lot of people who don't realize those chemicals are traveling through on the tracks near their homes, or who would not be prepared if a similar emergency happened somewhere else. And some of these chemicals don't need to be traveling through our towns, and so it's important for people to learn that they are traveling through and what they can do about that.
So what was spilled at Alberton, and where was it coming from, and where was it going?
I guess the two main chemicals that were spilled that were of greatest importance were chlorine, 130,000 gallons of it spilled out, and potassium cressolate, which is spent oil refinery waste, and 17,000 gallons of that spilled out as well. And this happened at 4 in the morning. People were asleep. The sirens went off for the local fire department, and people had no idea what was going on. And they were having trouble evacuating. Their cars weren't starting because of the chlorine in the air and the lack of oxygen, and they were really scared.
It's my understanding somebody died in this spill as well?
Yes, and you asked, the chlorine was coming from Georgia Pacific Mills in Washington, and it was going to a pulp and paper mill in Louisiana. There was a man on the train who did die. His name was Elmer Smith, and yes, he died from the chlorine inhalation.
So there's still chlorine and cressolate coming through our community. How often does that happen?
Yes, so on Montana Rail Link tracks in 1996, chlorine was one of the top 10 things traveling on the rails, along with other hazardous materials. And so definitely, and in terms of spent oil refinery waste, it's definitely something that travels across the rails a lot. Fuel in general, with the Yellowstone pipeline not currently running as a pipeline, is going across the rails much more frequently right now.
And I understand perhaps Montana Rail Link doesn't have the highest safety rating in the nation?
Right. At the time that the spill happened in 1996, they had the second worst accident record for their class size of railroad, and that's definitely something that people in Alberton did not know about and are very concerned about to this day, and are very upset about in relation to this spill having happened.
So what are some of the uses for the chlorine that's going along the rail cars?
So only 1% of chlorine use in this country is used for drinking water, and I guess that's the most highly debated use that couldn't be changed, although it's questionable whether we even need chlorine for that use. But it's also being used for PVC plastics, which is the largest growing area of chlorine use, for pulp and paper mills, numerous other random uses that we don't, pesticides, fertilizers, things that we could be reducing or eliminating from our source stream. So,
all right, well, why don't you describe just sort of the film in general and emphasize the first half of the film, what we're going to see tonight for our viewers.
Okay. The first part of the film focuses on letting people know where Alberton is, what happened on that day in terms of spill footage, how people responded, what it was like to evacuate at 4 in the morning, what kind of information they received at first. A lot of people were upset they didn't receive good information about what they were exposed to and what the potential health effects were. I've interviewed so many people who said that everyone, doctors, agencies, MRO, everyone was telling them that within 6 weeks their symptoms would be gone, their respiratory symptoms, their dizziness, nausea, headaches. And so the first part of the film focuses on what they were experiencing during the evacuation period and how those symptoms did not disappear after 6 weeks for many people. So that would be the beginning, and then sort of delving into what information they could have gotten in terms of material safety data sheets and what agencies could have done to help better protect their health in terms of not sending people back in for pet rescues 4 days after the spill happened, not sending hazmat teams in to clean up the site without appropriate hazmat gear or protective gear, things like that. So,
well, we're going to move in and start viewing our film, and we'll talk a little bit more about it after we see the first half here. Here we go.
Nobody reporting.
This is right for MRL. We got a train derailment just west of Alberton.
Okay. Any injuries?
Yes, we need an ambulance to head straight out to Walter, take the Petty Creek exit there and go across the river.
Okay.
And then go across the tracks and hang a right.
Go across tracks, hang a right, and then what?
And And then there should be a train down toward the west end. I think we got a chlorine spill. They're very poisonous gas. They're probably notify your officers out there.
Okay, let me get things going. Hold the line. Is this MRL?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know how many tanks or how many cars or?
No, it just happened there. We're just trying to get the crew out of there. They say there is a
How many crew members are out there? Do you know? Two crew members. And do you have radio contact with them now?
yes, we do.
Okay. And are they requesting medical assistance?
Yes, they are.
Okay. 40422. Reporting.
Yes, this is really weird, but we live in Alberton, across the Natural Pier Bridge, and our house just started shaking.
Okay, yeah, there has been an incident in the area there.
Did the train derail because there's smoke everywhere?
Yes, and we do have people responding right now, okay?
Train derailed, I believe, in Alberton.
Okay, and where are you calling from?
7223067, briefing 158
We've
Plateau
got a
Road.
train derailment.
And
Okay, so your wife already called me then, right?
yeah, right.
Got a
But I
train
drove down
derailment
there,
west
and there's
of
like a
Alberton,
green mist on
west
the
of
ground,
Tribal Camp.
and my
Got a
lungs started
chlorine
freaking
cloud
out, and I
hanging. We
just
don't
drove
know how
away
much
real
it's
quick.
filling, but we've got a tanker that's
He blew the
filled.
train whistle at me.
Okay, yeah, I would
Hazmat.
definitely stay out of the area, okay?
We're evacuating the house right now.
Have you
I
called
mean,
Sheriff?
you can start smelling
yet.
it up here.
Not yet.
if you
Can
want
you
to
do
get
that
out
for
here.
me?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
Right up. Okay, yeah, we're going to do that then, and we've got people headed on the way right now. Hang on just a
Should I
second.
contact my neighbors?
Just a second, okay?
Sure.
Calling 911, go ahead.
An SCBA is a self-contained breathing apparatus for fire crews or emergency crews, and there are different lengths of time on air breathing in them, and ours is 30 minutes maximum, which you actually have 20 minutes because you got to allow yourself enough time to get out of a burning building. And they're not the greatest, nothing new. I mean, it's kind of like hand-me-downs. And we didn't have just a few tanks to replace them. And not all of the members were able to have any. And on our last tank, when we realized there's no way we can get out to replace the tanks because of the cloud, we took it upon ourselves to take our masks off and conserve what air we had whenever our breathing was getting bad, we'd just take the hit off of it. Just to try to keep us going, because we were actually thinking more of getting the people out at that point. Even the one that was hitting the siren here in town, we had to have a public siren. It was pretty loud. She stayed in there pushing on the button manually, just keeping it going.
We're lucky enough to be upwind of it because we have kind of prevailing winds in there, blowing from the west. And but the chlorine is heavy, so in the evenings the wind stops and the stuff runs down the river. So during the, when Robbie came back and he was telling me things, I wasn't too worried. I thought it was just purely chlorine, and I thought it would probably dissipate pretty quickly because chlorine is a really reactive halogen. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't too worried in my glorious ignorance.
We had missed time, but we didn't know that we had been knocked out at that point. I found myself laying on the ground twice, and I didn't remember falling down or anything happening. I was standing, and the next thing I knew, I was awake and on the ground. And when I stood up, it took me down again. It was kind of like, whoa, you know. I walked in and got a cup of coffee and sat down and got real dizzy. My heart felt like it was going to come through my chest. It was going really, really fast. I was trying to rationalize at that time because I didn't know the spill had taken place. Our lips were tingling. We had a metal taste in our mouth. Our face was kind of numb. Well, we later discovered, after Ada had called the contractors later that morning at 9 o'clock when they didn't show up, that there had been a chemical spill. And we turned on CNN and we saw that, and it made some sense. There was Alberton right there on CNN, and we're going, holy shit, you know, that's just right over there. I called 911 and tried to explain to them that we had a metal taste in our mouth, that we were experiencing some oddities, and they told me we were in a safe zone to stay put and leave us alone, we're busy, and hung up. I was really upset when that happened. I paced around for about 10 minutes, and I decided that this was too big a deal for the county and the state, that they must not know what's going on, and they didn't have any idea that it came this far, apparently. I called Washington, D.C. to the EPA, and they wanted to authenticate who I was, and I gave them my Social Security number, and they called the Pentagon and the FBI and verified who I was, and then proceeded to put me through about a 45-minute survey on the phone. About three-quarters of the way through the survey, they interrupted and said they'd want me to finish the survey, but they wanted me to know that my answers had indicated that we were definitely in a dangerous zone and that we should be evacuated.
I'm Beverly Ridenauer. I have a son who's 13 and my husband. We also had two family members, house guests staying with us when the spill happened. We were awakened at 5 a.m. Neighbor called, told us what happened, told us we didn't have to leave unless someone came to the door. So we didn't leave. No one came to the door. We never left. 9 a.m. I left for work, drove through the cloud, became ill on my way, so I stopped here at the Frenchtown School, and about collapsed when I got out of the car. Paramedic put me in the ambulance and told me it was total evacuation. They told me they would send crew in to get my husband and family members, everybody out. An hour and a half later, no one showed up for them. So they covered their faces, they said, got in the vehicles, and left. They showed up at Frenchtown. My husband and one of our house guests needed oxygen. That's how severe the chemicals were that morning. You could smell the chlorine very strong. It was a huge fog. That's what it looked like, just, I guess, as if you were out on the river and the fog was rolling in that morning is what it looked like. I don't know how else to describe it. And the smell, of course, was just horrible. It was raining. So, of course, when the water hit the chlorine, that didn't help, and who knows what else was mixed with it. So we left. We went to a friend's house and stopped and picked up some groceries and stuff like that, and we stayed at a friend's house most of that first morning, listening to the radio, trying to find out what we were supposed to be doing, if we were going home that night. We all assumed at that time that we were going to be going home that night. And all of a sudden they came on the radio and said that if you needed accommodations to call a certain number. So we called the number and found out, no, we weren't going home that night.
And a Montana Rail Link train derailed and spilled 129,000 pounds of chlorine, 85 pounds of sodium chlorate, and 136,000 pounds of potassium cressolate, totaling 133 tons of chemicals.
They put us up in a hotel room, and we went to that hotel room and ended up staying there for 2 weeks, or just over 2 weeks anyway. During the time we were evacuated, it was very stressful. I tried to attend all the evacuation meetings because I thought sooner or later they're going to actually tell us what's going on, or give us some good information about what happened to us, what our futures may hold as far as being exposed to chemicals, and what's happening to our homes. That was our biggest fear and concern. Was we had no idea what we were exposed to exactly, the amounts. Was it safe for our house? We had a cat that we had left in there because we thought we were going to be right home. You know, was she still alive or was she dead? And we felt we never got those answers at all. We're still, to this day, talking about what does the future hold for our kids. My daughter every day talks about how she can't wait to be a mommy. And I'm afraid someday it's going to be a matter of having to tell her, you might want to think twice about it.
Within just a few days of the spill, local health officials made the decision to allow people back in to feed and water pets and livestock without having any information and any data on what chemical interactions had occurred between the chlorine and the potassium cressolate or any of the other chemicals there. There had only been chlorine monitoring done at that point in certain areas around the site. And the decision was made to allow people back in, and the people were not fully informed of potential risks and trusted the local health officials in that decision that everything was safe. So people returned into the evacuated zone secure and confident in the fact that it was safe to go because they had heard that from the incident command team and the local health officials, wearing no protective gear, not, to my knowledge, not even having been offered that as a choice, and not even having enough information to ask the right questions, which would have led them to make that choice. So in hindsight, it seems like a very, very misinformed and dangerous decision which had lasting implications for many people.
You were exposed more than I was too, though, because you came back to pick up the school animals on the pet feeding day on Saturday. We're around here all day on that bus, and I didn't come back in that day.
Yeah, I have pets in my classroom, some fish and a rat and birds and stuff like that, and it was a couple days, and they needed feeding and whatnot, so we had the pet retrieval day, and I basically spent a good part of the day driving around. They stopped us at a bridge while they were waiting for instructions and monitoring. They had the chlorine tester in the bus, and I came down to the house and went back, and I really think they say there was no monitoring chlorine, but I really felt like I'd been affected, tingly, it didn't kind of knock me for a loop there for a while right after that and during it. Tokers that live the house right up in here. They said when they went into their house and their shop, it was really strong chlorine smell in their garage, their outbuilding, and in the house. And they asked the guy that was monitoring the chlorine on the bus, "Well, come on in. Could you come in and take a monitoring in our outbuilding here? It's really, really strong." And the guy didn't do it. He wouldn't get off the bus and do it. And but I do think, and they say there was no detectable or minimal or whatever else when we were doing that. But I do, when I kind of trotted down the road because I didn't want to make them wait, and then I walked back, and I just really.
He was really sick that night. And
Yeah. And
During the evacuation and attending the evacuation meetings, or whatever you want to call them, I felt, and my husband felt also, that we weren't really given the medical information that we were asking for. A lot of people had a lot of questions, not only short-term, long-term. I know a lot of doctors came in and said, you know, if you had effects from the chlorine, you would be having them right now. They would be respiratory. But all the symptoms and the problems that we were experiencing had nothing to do with our respiratory. And I don't think they ever even tried to address any of the actual medical questions that people had. I think they kind of danced around them more and gave us more misinformation than actual good information.
They didn't follow their evacuation procedures, because there are procedures for all of these, and one of them was to take all their clothing, give them showers and new clothes. They did not take the old clothing, so all the people came to these meetings, and the smell in those rooms were just awful. They really were terrible, and so, you know, the rashes were going around just from being just with these people.
When we arrived at Frenchtown High School, we were told nothing. We basically all were grouping in, I think, what they call there a common area. There was no information given to us as far as remove your clothes, shower. Somebody did come in and say, gee, there are showers here if you'd like to shower, if anyone wants to, you know, clean up a little bit, since it was early morning. But nobody said anything about removing your clothes, showering, washing your eyes.
Right after we got out of town, they checked us out in the ambulance. That was it. No decontamination. They really didn't push to go into ER, except for the ones that was really in the bad stuff. And when they took us to the emergency room, they never took our clothes. As far as our fire gear, we wore them in the emergency room, so everybody else in the emergency room was getting contaminated.
I've been dealing with pesticide exposures for many, many years. The EPA has a pretty darn good manual out there, and part of the first thing you ask for is the safety sheet. That is standard EPA protocol for an acute toxic event of whatever nature. It's federal guidelines and has been for 15 years. I actually didn't see the MSDSs until, I believe it was 9 or 10 months later, something like that, because there was such a mixed bag of chemicals on that train that it was hard to come up with those things. That is standard operating procedure for an acute toxic exposure.
a lot of what people were being told was coming right from Montana Rail Link. The whole government, the state, the feds that were supposedly on the scene did not take control of the incident, you know, trying to find out for people independently of MRL what was going on at the scene, what was mixing, how far were the plumes going. The information that people were receiving for many weeks after the incident is very minimal, and in my personal opinion, very paltry as far as the severity of that catastrophe went. And at these meetings, this is what MRL was handing out to the kids. It's all about what not to do around the tracks. And this is totally absurd because, I mean, you had kids who were exposed to toxic chemicals, and MRL is the responsible party. And this is what they were giving kids, color books on what not to do along railroads.
When I have a breathing attack, it's like breathing through a clogged up straw, sort of. And more like trying to eat really thick jello through a clogged up straw. I have to use this, and I have to press this button, sprays in my mouth. And I have to put this one up my nose.
What is safe? Well, I think from our standpoint, a zero tolerance level is fine, and that's our objective. That's what we're working towards. And we will always be working towards that goal. So I think from our standpoint, as we move in that direction, like any industry, we're going to be looking at how we're doing relative to ourselves, performance in the past, and we're going to be looking at it in terms of the performance of our peer groups, other people in the industry, and to other modes of transportation, if you will, that we would identify as our principal competition.
Well, I remember one of the first meetings was all the people were saying that there was something out there they were reacting to, and Ellen Leahy with the health department and the Chris Weiss or something with the national EPA, and all the other people were saying, no, we're showing no detect or non-detect. Everything is within the limits for safety. And this woman was getting up there, and she was really getting upset because she was really feeling it. And finally, I raised my hand and I asked, and I said, "This is very pointed," but I said, you know, now you're putting this as if all your machines are showing no detect. All the people are saying they're being affected, and you're saying, all right, the machines are a better indication than the people who are breathing it.
When I got home that evening, I got a call from Jim Carlson of the Missoula City County Health Department,
and he said, we've had a bad chlorine accident out at Alberton. Some of the people are complaining about a pesticide-like odor. He said, do you think that there's some possibility that the chlorine could react with something from another car to make pesticide-like odors that people would be reporting? He said there was another tanker that had been ruptured in the area that had potassium cressolate, and did I think there was a possibility for reaction? And I considered that for a moment, and I said, yes, it looks to me like there could be a reaction. The potassium cressolate is a sort of material that can react with chlorine. I said I wanted to check with a couple of my organic colleagues just to confirm my feelings, but that I would be right back to him. And when I talked to them, one of them said, well, unless the chlorine was directly injected, I don't see it reacting. And the other one said, oh, I think there would be reactions. And knowing the scenario of the spill, looks like the chlorine was directly injected. So both of them sort of confirmed my suspicions. I haven't done extensive research on the accident. I mostly was just involved in that early analysis and helping decide on criteria for when it would be safe for people to go back. I helped develop a set of questions that had to be answered before they could go back in. So from what I was told and what I learned by looking at MSDS sheets is that the potassium cressolate had been used to help remove some sulfur from other fuels so that other fuels would have passed through the tank car. From my analysis, I can see in the tank car significant amounts of phenol, which is related to but much different from cresol, and it was in a concentration almost as high. I wasn't really out there during the cleanup, so I don't know firsthand how many of my recommendations were followed. One of the things that I recommended to the people managing the site, and I don't know whether this was followed out or not, was that the types of compounds that were formed with the chlorine and cressolate reacting are potentially soluble in water and persistent in the environment. So I recommended that they cover the sludge trough with plastic to keep any rain from percolating through there and carrying the material into the groundwater. I know later on I looked at the remediation of the site, and they had excavated the soil quite deeply in that area, although I saw reports after that saying they did find traces of some compounds even in the area below where they'd done the excavation. I did find one example of a cross product that had the positions chlorinated at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that gives the potential for dimerization between two of those components to give a dioxin that would have the bad geometry. So there was one particular product that I saw that had a potential to dimerize into a 2,3,7,8 substitution pattern, which on a dioxin is the one you want to avoid. did think it would be appropriate to test the Cressolate tanker to see if there were any dioxins.
This whole thing with what the agencies are coming out with now, that the hazardous waste was contained, and that even if it was there and there were these high parts of trichlorophenols and phenols, that it didn't affect people, it just doesn't wash. Because you have the pet rescuers who went in the first few days afterwards, who thought they were going into a chlorine spill there again, and that the chlorine levels were safe, and they were being monitored, and if there was any problem, they would be immediately evacuated. And it was completely inaccurate. And the agencies should have known that. There were already complaints of pesticide smells, and why they let people go in before they monitored for organic compounds, I don't know. It makes no sense to me when they knew that there was an entire tank load of them out there on the ground. They were not protecting people's health. They had a responsibility. And then they will tell you, well, people really wanted to go in, and we were being pushed. And I know that. I saw that. Nobody wants to be out of their home. But if there had been full disclosure, if the public had understood that there were trichlorophenols, 500 and 600, 700 parts per million, phenols at 20,000 parts per million in the tank car, and 7,000 parts per million on the ground, I think the public, if they had realized the safety issues, would have not pushed so hard. They would have understood that they were out for good reason. The pushing came because what we were told was that it was safe in Alberton, but we were only evacuated in case of this chance of chlorine re-entering while they were unloading those tank cars. And that's why people wanted to go home, because they thought that they could be there and leave if need be. And there again, the disclosure was not accurate. If people had known the truth and had been informed, I don't think they would have gone on the pet rescues like they did. I don't think that they would have wanted to go in. And I know for sure that a lot of people would not have ever made re-entry.
There was an awful lot of manipulation take place. I watched the railroad manipulate Alberton people to go back. I stood up and asked them to do an area photography of the area so we could see the impact. What did they do? They went downtown Main Street with a video camera and videos everybody's house and the town cat, and this is what your town looks like without you. Don't you want to go home? And when they said that people could go home if they wanted to, everybody took that as though it was okay, and 800 people hot-footed at home, in my opinion, to a poisoned environment, which is probably still poisoned today.
As far as, the way people are kind of divided here in town, the reason I believe, just kind of sitting back and watching and talking to people off and on and just listening, the reason that they're kind of divided is this was originally a railroad town. And the majority, old-time members, I guess, they're going to defend the railroad. They have possibly pensions to the railroad, I don't know. It hasn't really gotten real bad as far as that, but in a manner of speaking, busted friends up. You know, people just don't communicate real well anymore. Everybody's trying, you know. And even the ones that still have a problem with it, they keep quiet to keep it down, you know. And just kind of continue on with life.
And when the train came down the tracks with the not supposed to be hot soil, this was supposed to be the soil that was very readily able to be transported out of the area without hurting anybody, it was like somebody punched me in the face. And my son was in the living room, and I could hear him screaming because, and when I got in the house, he was holding his hands over his ears. I'll never forget this. Holding his hands over his ear like this, and the kid was screaming. And he's like, my ears, my eyes, and he couldn't breathe. He went into an asthma attack right away. And we left, of course. But I looked at the train. I can see the train from here, and the cars were supposed to be covered. The cars were not covered tight, tarp down. The cars had a tarp over them and some miscellaneous stuff on top to hold the tarp. But the tarp edges were billowing in the wind. So we're talking G-force, soil blowing out all over the ground. And I'd already cleaned my house. I'd already washed everything from soup to nuts in this house. I'd cleaned carpets and everything. And of course we had to evacuate again. And we went back to the hotel, and when I came back the next time to clean the house, Justin couldn't even come down the hill all the way. And within an hour of leaving the Missoula area, his peak flow went up. I mean, a majorable amount. It seems to me it was like 50 to 60 points on the peak flow meter. His breathing capacity increased. And he couldn't come in the house, so I ended up having to rip out all the carpeting. Of course, RailLink wasn't going to send somebody out here to expose them to whatever they contaminated my house with. I had to pull the carpeting out, and by the time I got done, I was sick.
Along the same lines with the meter reader in the administrative record in Missoula, there's this letter dated May 9th, 1996 from Plum Creek about sort of the same issue.
This was the work crew?
Right,
yeah.
Relocating logging crews while cleanup occurs at the Alberton derailment site.
And when I was somewhere in the Great Stack, is some correspondence regarding that, and when the crews indicated that they were having headaches, we said, our recommendation is get out of there. And I believe that they then conferred with the responsible party, and I think they came to some sort of arrangement, and I'm not exactly sure. Are you folks going to interview RailLink too?
When it was, I mean, I'm just reading from your letter. You said the DEQ supports Plum Creek's decision and believes the temporary relocation would be in the best interest for all concerned. I'm just wondering about the people who live right there. Was a temporary relocation thought to be advisable for them as well? And what was
probably it would have been based on how they felt, but I don't recall ever, those people may have left long ago.
Well, that was some really amazing footage. Welcome back. You've just seen the first half of A Toxic Train Runs Through It. We'll be airing the second half next Sunday night at 8 o'clock, and Monday we'll re-air it at 5:30 if you don't get a chance to see it Sunday. We're back in the studio here with Lisa Mosca, who did most of the filming, directing, and editing of that piece for, what was it, a thesis project?
Yes, it was for a master's thesis. Yep.
And so for a little bit of a preview, what are we going to be seeing next week that we haven't seen already?
Okay, the second half of the film goes a lot more into the medical community's response in the Montana and especially the Missoula area to victim symptoms and the ongoing health problems that victims have been having, and then into an overview of the chemicals that were spilled and how they play into the larger global system of chemical production and the effects that those chemicals are having elsewhere and what we're using, especially chlorine, for in this country and globally right now.
So there's still a lot of legal battles going on out there. Could you talk about that just briefly?
Okay, in relation to
the spill,
the second half of the film also actually focuses a lot on the fact that unfortunately this incident was not handled as well as people would have liked, and as a result of that a lot of people have had lawsuits against the company Montana Rail Link, who was responsible for the spill happening. It was their train that derailed, and basically right after the spill happened, I would say they pushed a lot of people to settle for small amounts of money without accurate information about what the potential long-term health effects of the chemicals that spilled would be. And so people have been having a lot of health problems that have settled, and those that haven't settled have been waiting a long time to go to court to get what I would say is not even adequate compensation, because nothing can adequately compensate you for losing your health for the rest of your life. And so a lot of people have focused on the negativity of lawsuits, but in this country right now, that's the only recourse that people have been left with, aside from focusing on educating other communities for future prevention.
How about folks that have settled and find a year, 2-3 years later now that they're still having health problems? Is there any chance they'll be able to go back to the courts and ask for compensation?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately at this point the class action suit that was filed, which did include a category for people who had settled but fraudulently under false pretenses without fully knowing the impacts of what they were exposed to, that's been basically excluded from the class action lawsuit by the judge who's overseeing that case. And so basically the only recourse that I see for people who have settled now is to hope that if the class action lawsuit goes through, it asks for medical monitoring for all victims and for compensation for all victims in terms of hopefully some good medical attention in the future.
How about our community here? I guess there's been some recent changes in how much chlorine is around. Could you talk about that just briefly?
Sure. Well, one of the dangers of having chlorine use is that organochlorines often form either through spills like this or through use in pulp and paper mills for bleaching paper so that it's white. And recently within the Missoula area, since Stone Container decided to end its chlorine use in its bleaching, we have less, hopefully, dioxin going into the air and less use of chlorine locally. However, I have to say that that doesn't exclude the fact that we're still along the lines for chlorine traveling from places like Washington, where this chlorine was coming from, and heading especially to the southeast now. And it's sad that people in Alabama are going to have an increased use of chlorine production potentially, or at least continue to have chlorine used in their pulp and paper plants, and continue to be exposed to things. But locally we can breathe more easily now.
So it's my understanding that the EPA is sending someone out here soon to perhaps review their involvement in the whole Alberton spill. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We're actually really excited because the Ombudsman of the EPA, his name is Bob Martin, is going to be arriving in Missoula on May 3rd, and the importance of that is that he's going to be looking into citizen complaints about what was initially done during the spill period and what the EPA could do now to help residents of Alberton. About a year and a half ago, the EPA did step out of the situation in Alberton, and the Ombudsman is the only person who has the ability to bring them back in and to reevaluate what was done initially during the spill period. And that's what residents are most concerned about. They're concerned that at the time that the spill happened, there was not enough appropriate sampling done, and that people were not adequately informed about what chemicals spilled, how they may have mixed, and what people may have been exposed to.
So is there a meeting going to be happening?
So there's going to be a meeting probably happening in Frenchtown, and so people should be aware and looking in the papers for time and date for that.
Before we leave for today, what can people do, Lisa, if they want to get more involved with the Alberton folks?
I guess one of the things they can do is they can contact the Alberton Community Coalition for Environmental Health that has formed, and the number there is 406-728-7572. And another thing that they can do is become more active on your local emergency planning committee and ask your local legislators and your local city council people to get involved in letting people know what's traveling across the rails, and let them know that you think that's important, that you as community members want to know that information. So,
thanks again.